Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about how boards can facilitate the intersection of ESG and strategy. And joining me to have this conversation is Matt DiGuiseppe, who's the Vice President of Research and ESG for the Diligent Corporation, and formerly had many stewardship roles where he worked with C-suites and boards for State Street and also for TIAA-CREF. So welcome, Matt.
Thanks. Great to be here, TK.
You know, this isn't a topic where we have to give a whole lot of background, because if somebody doesn't know the pressure that's been generated by ESG by many sources, but certainly by investors, they must have been living under a rock. So, but when we look for several years, it's mostly been about disclosures. And we know that a lot of that time has been spent trying to figure out what should be measured. And now we have organizations that have really got their arms around that and making good progress. So now the conversation sort of starts to change a little bit, but one of the big things around the disclosures was earlier in your career, you worked on sending letters to the S&P 500 and asking them to respond to the Carbon Disclosure Project survey, which interestingly enough, today has over 10,000 respondents. So how do you see this conversation evolving with ESG and particularly related to the survey?
Yeah, I really do appreciate that. And it is interesting because it's evolved incredibly quickly. Not long ago, investors were just begging for some information around a company's ESG exposures. And frankly, it was really just about climate and your GHG exposures. And over the past, decade or so, we've seen the alphabet soup spring up that folks hear about in the boardroom all the time, right? The CDP, the SASB, the GRI, the WEF framework, and we could go on and on and on, right? And all of those frameworks provide a way for companies to communicate their ESG metrics and strategy to shareholders in a decision useful way, and including other stakeholders. And for many, many years, it really was just about that, providing data to the marketplace, to your stakeholders and to investors, so they could understand sort of where the risks existed throughout their portfolio. What's been really interesting about this past year, and I do think that COVID's contributed to the acceleration, is the focus has shifted to some degree from just being about more disclosure and more data to really understanding about how companies are taking this data and integrating it back into their business and their strategy and the decision making that it's driving. So it's not just, what are your GHG emissions or what is your GHG reduction goal, but it's how are you thinking about that in the context of the decisions that you're making around capital allocation, around M&A. Not necessarily to say that you need to always be cutting, but that you need to be aware of how your business decisions are impacting your overall commitments around these issues. That's also true on the social side, where companies are making commitments around increasing their diversity and really addressing DE&I head on, which is great to see. But then investors are going to be interested not only in sort of what are your top line goals, but how does that play out throughout the organization? How are you living those values that you're communicating to the marketplace?
Well, it's certainly exciting for Diligent that you have come aboard in this capacity, not only because of your experiences, but you're coming at a very interesting time where we're sort of morphing out of the disclosure phase into the implementation phase. And now we have to see that sort of intersection of ESG being woven into strategy. Okay. So, I know, Matt, that it's not as simple as sort of just setting a climate goal or a diversity goal. So talk a little bit about the key of that intersection and what why that's so important for us moving ahead if ESG is going to be part of strategy.
Yeah, I think it's about, very much so understanding what the business's risk profile is given its specific industry and business lines. And there may be multiple, many companies are sort of cross over several different industries, but understanding what that risk profile is, understanding where the data is to allow you to dig into that and monitor it. And of course, setting goals is important, but it's not just about always driving downward, right? It's not just about decreasing your water usage or decreasing your emissions, but understanding how that fits into the broader strategy. The example that I like to use is, around a chip manufacturer. We're going through a situation where there's a global shortage of semiconductor chips currently, which do use a lot of water. And you've seen a lot of manufacturers choose to adopt water reduction goals. If you think about sustainability in the broader picture of sort of what's good for the market as a whole, as well as what's in the best interest of any given company, it wouldn't necessarily make sense for a manufacturer at this point in time to reduce production in the interest of hitting that water reduction goal today. It means that they might need to think about whether or not the timing of achieving that goal needs to shift in order to meet the current market demand. And that's not a failure to incorporate sustainability into strategy. That's actually a positive. That actually demonstrates true integration, where as a board and as a management team, you got kind of a discussion around what are the trade-offs that you're making in your decision making, and how do they impact the long-term sustainability of the business today and into the future, and do we feel comfortable with that? That's also really important conversation to think about in the context of the growing integration of ESG metrics into executive compensation, right? Executive compensation, by putting something into executive compensation, that's a way to demonstrate the overall commitment and the importance of these particular issues to the management team and to the board and to the company's long-term success. But when you do incorporate things like ESG into executive compensation, there's a great potential for unintended consequences, right? There are ways that you can achieve your GHG reduction goals by making non-core investments in, say, offsets or a wind farm, where you need to understand sort of overall if the decisions that you're making align with the long-term business, and provide leeway for executives and management teams to discuss those trade-offs and reach sort of what is the best decision for the company in the context of its overall strategy, rather than sort of how is that going to affect my executive compensation payout. I like to joke that discretion is not a dirty word when it comes to compensation. It actually provides the board with an opportunity to provide a window into the decision-making and the discussion that happens between the board and management around these difficult decisions. So this can be one way where boards can sort of marry discretion with ESG in the compensation program to really inform investors and communicate the value of these issues to the board.
Well, I always thought it was a dark year when investors pushed to take discretion out of the process, because it's just too hard not to give that flexibility to a compensation committee to have, like you said, those discussions and look at that stuff. And on another note, there was a tremendous gap between what investors wanted in ESG and what boards felt. They kept putting it way down on their priority list. And I'm sort of happy to report that there's progress now, and boards sort of accepting and understanding that this is something that has to happen. I still think in your intersection of ESG and strategy that it's going to take us. You're going to see a couple lead companies sort of take the lead, this coming year, and then I think we'll see a lot more follow, and eventually it will be, part of the norm. But as we both know, that is going to take a year or two to get companies to see, how that can happen and how it can actually work for the company. But so Matt, we got about 2 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you, specifically, from your point of view, how can boards help facilitate the weaving of ESG into corporate strategy?
So I think this one is actually fairly easy, which is creating space for the discussion and making sure that there's time on the agenda to bring the discussion around strategy back into that and integrate that ESG element in terms of, how does this impact our goals? If you're looking at an M&A transaction, understanding what's the impact that this business will have on the goals that you've set, not necessarily as a gating criteria, but just so that you set that framework that management teams understand that it's an expectation that this be incorporated into the decision-making process. Not that it drives the decision-making process, but that it happen alongside it rather than as an afterthought. So creating the space and time for that on what is an already incredibly packed agenda can be incredibly important. And, we're seeing boards do that in a number of different ways, whether it's even, renaming committees, looking at charters for where, this fits in most appropriately across the board, structure, but really making sure that it's something that the board demonstrates is a valuable endeavor and something that they expect from the management team.
Well, that's great advice, and I certainly wish you good fortune as you tackle this for Diligent. I know you're going to be producing some great guides and content, and I invite everybody to Diligent Insights, where I'm sure ultimately a lot of your work will be displayed, and also in the portal. So thanks for taking the time, Matt, to join us. And again, we'll look forward to seeing all those guidelines coming out to help companies today.
Of course. Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about the materials that Diligence produced is it can meet you where you are. We have, things that people can use when you're just sort of familiarizing yourself with the space, or if you're really thinking about going deep on that strategy connection, we're happy to provide resources to help you.
Well, again, thanks for joining us. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.